All right, Alexander, let's do an update with what is going on in Ukraine. We could talk about what's going on the ground. We could talk about what was an offensive in Kherson from the Ukraine military. You may want to touch upon a kind of offensive that's happening. A lot of progress actually is being made in the direction of Bakhmut by the Wagner guys, which no one is really talking about that. But that's significant. A lot of it is actually connected to a lot of resources, a lot of assets that have been pulled from various other areas, Odessa, Kiev, as well as in the Bakhmut direction. All of that's been pulled down for the success at Kherson, which is now having the knock-on effect of allowing Wagner to move even more quickly towards Bakhmut. So everything's kind of connected with all of these various counteroffensives. And maybe we can touch upon the what's going on with things in the Kremlin, with things in the deep state and the Biden White House. A lot of talk about tactical nukes and regime change in Russia, and Zelensky talking about regime change, Biden talking about regime change, the Collective West talking about Putin must go. They're actually using that word now. Putin must go. And we have a Kremlin that's been very, very quiet. Some people may say cool and collected, but quiet, very quiet it seems. Even though they have talked out about Zelensky's latest comments about preemptive nuclear strike. They did talk out about that. So anyway, we get on the ground.
Yeah, let's talk about the situation on the ground. Now, I'm going to actually make a point here, which is that I've actually been trying to collate where the numbers of the soldiers are. So I'm talking about Ukrainian troops. So Ukraine started its Kherson offensive back in September with around 25,000 men. The Kharkov offensive was carried out with about 9,000 men. The advance on Liman was carried out with about 6,000 men. Now, there's a big Ukrainian grouping in Zaporozhye, and there's a lot of talk that this is major. The next big Ukrainian attack is going to be carried out with those troops. Now, 25,000 Kherson, 9,000 Kharkov, 6,000 Liman, unknown number in Zaporozhye. The number of Ukrainian troops who have been defending Bakhmut city is currently set put at around 30,000. So that gives you an idea, perhaps, of where the real battle is. The biggest concentration of Ukrainian troops has been bigger even than what they started the Kherson offensive with. And that's the amount of troops in Bakhmut city at the moment, apparently, Ukrainian troops there. It seems, exactly as you said, that a few weeks ago, days ago even, it was more than that. Now, and what has been happening is that as Ukraine has been finding it difficult to make progress with these offensives, they've been pulling troops from every direction. They pull them from the northern borders, so apparently vast areas of the borders with Russia, like Chernigov region especially apparently, now are empty of troops. Odessa apparently has been largely stripped of the troops that it has. But over the last couple of weeks, basically since the Liman offensive began, they started to pull troops out of Bakhmut and out of that central area of Donetsk. And they've even redeployed troops from Bakhmut to Kherson, as well as those troops from Chernigov, in order to keep the momentum of those offensives going. So you could argue that what they are doing is that they're weakening the key front line, which is Bakhmut. That was where the major battles were going on. They've been weakening their front lines in order to achieve these offensives, success in these offensives in other places where there are fewer Russian troops, and that they're doing that principally for PR reasons. Now, we've discussed the Kharkov offensive at length. We've discussed Liman, which in my opinion, and I still maintain this, was basically a sideshow. Last weekend, they achieved a breakthrough in Kherson region. But again, you have to look at the numbers of troops involved. They sent an armored column down a road, an asphalt, a metalled road on the banks of the Dnieper River, south, and it reached a town, a small town called Duchany, where it was stopped. Now, that armored column numbered 3,000 men, and it had about 150 armored vehicles. So again, only a tenth of the size of the force that's defending Bakhmut. Now, what the Russians then did is that they pulled troops that they'd had who'd been defending very successfully on the front line that had been on the Ingulets River, this river, that borders Kherson region. They pulled those troops back and they formed a new front line. And this is a much shorter front line and it's supposedly more echeloned. And at the moment, Ukraine has been trying to hammer against this front line. And up to this time, they haven't been able to break through. But again, it was a case less of the Ukrainians defeating the Russians. It was more a case of the Russians pulling back. Now, this seems to be, at the moment, the Russian strategy. You inflict heavy losses on Ukraine wherever the Ukrainians are carrying out offensives. If you get yourself in a tactical hull, as you did in Liman, or as you did in North Kherson, you preserve the lives of your soldiers and you pull back. But in Bakhmut, the main battlefield, you don't take any of your own troops away from that. You don't do what the Ukrainians are doing, which is disperse them around the battlefields. You keep advancing. You keep fighting. You take advantage of the fact that Ukraine is taking its troops away, and you single-mindedly focus on achieving victory in this very important city in Donbass, which is, if you like, the real Stalingrad of this war. And if you win there, then you're going to win. You know that you're going to win in the rest of Donbass. So what all this tells me is this. The Ukrainians are fighting one strategy, one type of war. The Russians are fighting a completely different one. The Russians are fighting a war which is a military war. They are focusing on the place of most importance. They're keeping their best troops there, the Wagner Group and all that. They're making big advances in Bakhmut. It seems as if Bakhmut's fall is now days, perhaps weeks away at most. Ukraine is fighting a political war. They want to gain as much ground as possible, even if that ground is largely deserted, even if they're occupying villages, which most people have left, even if that ground doesn't really matter very much, because they want to create a political effect. Now, I have to say, it seems to me at this moment in time, both strategies from each side are achieving a great deal of success. The Russians are breaking through in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is likely to fall. They are inflicting heavy losses on Ukraine. But on the other side of the picture, Ukraine has changed the narrative. They are advancing. They are gaining ground. The Russians are retreating ahead of them. And that is provoking a lot of optimism in the West, all kinds of headlines about how Ukraine has Russia on the run. And that is feeding through into doubts and tensions and recriminations and anger in Russia. Because people in Russia are saying, why are we retreating instead of advancing? Why is our country so much more powerful than Ukraine now retreating in all sorts of places? And, can we really be confident that places like Kherson and Lysychansk, which are vitally important to us, are truly safe? So the two sides are fighting different wars. Each, at the moment, can probably be satisfied with how they're doing.
Right. It sounds to me like Ukraine is, not even Ukraine, the collective West is using this offensive in order to play up to their strength, which is soft media power. I mean, the offensive to me just seems like one of many tools to advance their soft media narrative. And they do have a huge strength and a huge advantage, and they've had that advantage since the beginning of the conflict. They understood that their big advantage over Russia is the media. Their massive advantage is media, social media, traditional media, all of it. They've got the advantage there, distribution, you name it. And it seems like the offensive, while it is successful in gaining a lot of territory, its real purpose is to advance that media weapon that they have. It's to bolster that media weapon that they have, and it's doing it. It's working because you rarely see stories about Bakhmut. Rarely, if any, stories about Bakhmut, but we're flooded with stories about the success of the Ukraine military, and you even have the President of the United States talking about how the success of the Ukraine military means that the plans of Vladimir Putin have collapsed. His plans are falling apart. And just to go on to your point about empty villages that Ukraine is gaining, even the New York Times said that a Ukrainian soldier says the army is liberating land without people on it. That's coming from the NYT I'm seeing here. So, I mean, they're gaining a lot of territory. And this territory the gains in territory is meant to feed into this huge advantage that the collective West has over Russia. What is the ultimate goal to all of this? What is the ultimate goal to this soft power weapon that the U.S. has? And how does Ukrainian advancements feed into that end goal?
It is absolutely straightforward what the goal is. I mean, where the West is concerned and where Ukraine is concerned, there is absolutely no doubt. It is to provoke a political crisis in Moscow. And they are, in my opinion, I don't know how close they are to achieving that, but they are making some progress in that direction. And I mean, I think we have to be very clear about this. If you go to Russian media now, and I don't just mean, the sort of Telegram channels that we read, which are mainly written by people who are either on the anti-Putin right or on the anti-Putin communist left, but people of that kind. But they're not friends of Vladimir Putin, but they're all talking about how Shoigu is a useless defense minister, how the Russian military doesn't know what it's doing, that Putin himself doesn't know what he's doing. There's massive criticisms of those people of the military. But beyond that, even Russian mainstream media, even Russian, talk shows, and, lots of Russia is a place where talk shows take place a lot on TV, national television. You're now getting open criticisms of the way in which the war is being conducted. And that is now becoming an important and I think rather dangerous loop. And this is where I find the Kremlin's response to this very difficult to understand. Because instead of actually coming out and taking this on and saying, look, there's nothing to worry about. We have the situation under control. We know what we're doing. We're not obviously going to discuss our plans, but, let Ukraine have its day. But, we are confident that we're going to achieve our objectives. And we have reasons to know that. The Kremlin is being silent. And in this silence, it's feeding in on all of those doubts that are accumulating. So let's just recap on some of the things that we floated on our videos. And Denis Pushilin, the chief of the Crimean government, said that once these regions were incorporated into Russia, the special military operation would be upgraded into a counter-terrorism operation. No such announcement. There was talk, including from Peskov, Putin's spokesman, that, the constitution of the Russian Federation is now in effect. These regions are incorporated in Russia. Aggression is now being carried out against Russia. There would be some kind of ultimatum. Nothing like that. There was talk that once these regions were incorporated into Russia, there would be some kind of major move by the Russian military. No sign of it. Everything carries on in the Kremlin as always. Putin has had a meeting on economics, he's had a meeting with his economics ministers. Economy is doing well. He tells us industrial production has now fully recovered to where it was back in 2021. There's still some problems because consumer demand is low. He has a meeting with teachers. He tells the teachers, well, I'm confident that the situation in the regions will be stabilized, and then goes on to say how Russia values Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture and all those kind of things. But none of those big announcements, the personnel changes, the drama that everybody was expecting has happened. And I have to say, that seems to me, in the face of this media offensive from the West, a risky strategy. I mean, look at the contrast. You have Joe Biden talking about the fact that we are on the brink of nuclear Armageddon. Talking about, the real risk about, nuclear war being on the horizon. And we have Putin meeting with Russian teachers talking about the great value of Ukrainian culture. I mean, it's like they inhabit different universes. And in a country at war, a government that behaves like this, that takes things so calmly and so quietly and in such an eerily calm way, I have to say, it does seem to me that it must be running some risks.
Oh, why? why,
Well,
why are they being so quiet? I mean, what are the reasons? We can name a lot of. We can start talking about a lot of things. But what do you think is the reasons why they're so quiet? I mean, Russians can. I mean, to be fair, the Russian government can put out a good media spin on things. Just look at the foreign ministry. They have the capability if they really want to do it. Why are they not doing it?
I'm going to say two things about this. Firstly, I think that the Russian government must feel extremely confident that despite all this criticism that's, flickering around the edges, that its underlying position in Russia remains extremely strong. And I mean, I've been looking at the polling data. I mean, there's been a small dip in Putin's popularity, but I mean, it's, from 83% to 77%. I mean, it's almost within the statistical margin of error. I mean, it's almost meaningless. I think also Putin and the government are confident that within the government itself, everybody is fully on side. Every member of this government, all the people, all the top people, that that there's not going to be any type of palace coup or anything of that kind. So I think they are confident about the political situation in Moscow. I think, and I have to say this, I think they must be confident about the military situation on the ground as well. I think they probably are looking at all these offensives that the Ukraine has been launching. They notice that it's capturing empty towns and small towns and empty villages and gaining territory, but the territory that is gaining isn't really anything very useful. And I think that they feel that the military, the existing military that's there, has that situation under control as well. So I think that's one reason I think that they're confident about the underlying strength of their position. Now, as to why they're keeping silent, why they're not going out and reassuring their public, I think one thing I have to say, which is that the foreign ministry is very good at spin and explaining things to people. The government as a whole often isn't. So this isn't so unusual. But I think that at some level, they want to keep everybody guessing. They want to feed doubts. They feel that within Russia, they have the situation under control. So they're letting Ukraine take ever bigger risks, denuding its borders of troops, throwing away more men, letting the Ukrainians spin along, keeping the West uncertain about what Russia's moves are going to be. And I think that they probably think that this works to their advantage. I have to say, to me, looking at this from a distance, it's a policy with risks. I mean, clearly there are risks. I mean, I don't know how well this has all been assessed and thought through, but it's not as if the Russians aren't taking some risks now, and we'll see whether those risks are justified and whether the situation is indeed as much under control as the Russian government presumably believes it is.
Yeah, I agree with you. When you try to control the clock and control the timing of things, when you're constantly in a state of defense, or at least prolonged defense, I mean, it may work, but there is a risk that something happens, something unexpected occurs. Absolutely. There was a development that took place a couple of days ago. A couple of drones. They moved into Kiev. They actually bypassed all air defense. I think like 4 or 6 drones, and they hit a military facility in an area not far off from the center of Kiev, known as Bilaya Tserkov. And the amount of distance that these drones had to travel was something like 300 kilometers from the front line, but they made it through no problem. And these kamikaze drones, they hit their target. And the Zelensky regime was furious that the videos and photos came out of this facility hit by these drones. Is that an indication that something in Ukraine's rear is breaking down because they've moved so much towards the front, or do you think that's a one-off?
No, I don't think it's a one-off at all. And I'm going to say straight away, I think something is brewing on the northern fronts. We've had information that the Belarusian railway system has, in effect, been placed under military control. Lukashenko has talked about the fact that there's a Russian-Belarusian military grouping being set up. He says Belarus is now actively assisting in the special military operation, even if its own troops are not going to participate directly. And there's also increasing talk, including in the British media, of some major Russian build-up in Belgorod. It's been going on for a while. I think what has been happening is that over the last few weeks, the Russians have been testing. They made those attacks on the power stations, if you remember, some weeks ago. And I think they wanted to see how those would work. They made these attacks on Kiev as well. They're sort of, you can see them almost sort of calibrating and preparing for what I'm sure is going to be a big offensive at some point, probably when the winter frosts set in mid-November or some such time, which would be about the time when a lot of these reservists that have been called up have completed their training, or rather their retraining. So I don't think it's chance. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that this is, and I don't think it's any kind of one-off. I think it is definitely part of some kind of overall strategy. Difficult to work out what it is exactly, but that's what I think. Yeah.
But what does it say about Ukraine? Does it say, if anything, maybe it doesn't say anything at all. Maybe this is common that drones slip through and hit an area close to the capital city. I would think that the capital city would be the most protected from top to bottom with regards to any type of attack. Even the smallest of drones would not be able to get through the capital city. Does that tell you that Ukraine is exposed?
Yes, it does. I mean, it shows that the Ukrainian defense system is full of holes. By the way, just before we did this program, there was information that the Ukraine also tried to send a drone deep into Russia. In other words, they tried to do something similar to the Russians, but that drone was shot down near a city called Kaluga. It was apparently heading towards Moscow, but it didn't get there. So the Ukrainians tried to do the same, but they weren't able to succeed, whereas the Russians clearly can. They can send drones, these attack drones, to Kiev, and they can launch attacks. And clearly, as I said, this is partly testing the defenses of Kiev, finding out how effective they actually are, and it's turning out that they're not very effective at all.
Okay, two final questions. What do you say if someone tells you at this moment in time that these regions are part of Russia, but they're occupied by a foreign enemy? If you're Russia, you've just incorporated new regions, but these regions that you've incorporated are now either under attack or currently occupied by a foreign power. How do you reconcile that?
Well,
If you're
indeed,
a great power, I mean,
yeah.
that's the first thing, and then just a real quick follow up to that. Our live stream with Patrick Lancaster, he said that the people of Donbass will feel relief when the fighting in and around Bakhmut and Avdiivka, all this fighting in these areas is complete and they're fully liberated. Do you believe that will also be a turning point psychologically, militarily as well, but also psychologically with regards to everything that's going on in Ukraine, since we're talking about Bakhmut?
I'm going to answer the second question first, because I actually think that the one leads to the other. I think that it is absolutely clear now that the decisive battles, as always, throughout this war, from the very beginning, are happening in Donbass, and that the key battles at the moment are not happening in Kherson region or in Kharkiv region or whatever. They're happening in Bakhmut and in Donetsk, in and around Donetsk city. In other words, ending the shelling. And I think once that has been brought to an end, once resistance in Bakhmut city has been broken, whilst the Ukrainian concentrations around Avdiivka are encircled or driven back, then I think that is going to have a massive psychological effect. I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. I think the need to end the shelling of Donetsk city and to sort of secure Donetsk region has been the major, if you like, the major preoccupation of the Russian political and military leadership since basically the start of this military operation, but especially since those troops were pulled back from the areas around Kiev back in the spring. So I think that will have a massive psychological effect, and it will, if it's achieved without any major setbacks in other places, like losing Kherson, for example, if that's achieved, which it looks as if within the next couple of weeks it will be, then I think that will change the mood radically in Donetsk and in Russia itself, and it will reinforce the conviction that this is a war that is now being won, and that the prime purpose of this mission, which is to protect the people of Donbass, that at least now has been achieved. And that brings me now to the your first question, which is, I think, an absolutely valid one, which is, if you're a great power or a country that claims to be a great power, like Russia, a nuclear power, and part of your territory, what you say is your territory, is being occupied by another country, one which, for all its backing for the West, is not much less powerful than yourself, then, it's, to put it mildly, not a good look. I mean, and it's not a good look in Russia itself. I mean, I come back to that original point that, the Kremlin is taking risks with Russian public opinion and with political support in Russia itself by this eerie silence that it's assuming in this. Because, of course, that question which you asked is one which lots of Russians are asking. They're saying, why are we giving up what is now Russian territory? I mean, Liman is now a Russian city, yet we've given it up. Those 17 villages in Kherson region, they might be empty of people, but the Ukrainians have occupied them, and they are now Russian territory. So what kind of a country is it which claims itself to be a great power that can't defend territory like this? So lots of people are asking those questions, asking that question. in Russia. It's, as I say, all over the Telegram channels. It's all over um, the um, the talk shows on Russian television. It's in the newspapers there as well. It's on social media in Russia. Now, if Bakhmut falls and is liberated, as the Russians would say, if the artillery forces are pulled, the Russian Ukrainian artillery forces are pushed away from Donetsk city, so that the this rain of fire on Donetsk city comes finally to an end, and people there can start to live a normal life, then all of those doubts, all of those criticisms will melt away. But the Kremlin, I repeat, is taking a risk with Russian public opinion by playing its cards so close to its chest and keeping the pace of things so slow.
All right. Let's end it there. Very quickly, what are the chances you think that the West could actually engineer regime change in Russia?
I think none, actually, and I think that's one of the. I think that's the primary factor. I mean, I've looked at the, the opinion surveys. I think, we're talking about a country which has felt itself to be under pressure from the West for a very, very long time. I think the overwhelming sentiment in Russia is that they still support Putin and they still want Putin to remain in charge, and they do not want to see any crisis or political crisis in Russia, and they're certainly not going to come out and protest and say that Putin should go. What they want, which is a different thing, is for Putin to start listening to what they're telling him and to be more proactive in his conduct of the war. So they don't want to overthrow him. They still support him, but they are uneasy about the way he's playing this. So I don't think there's any prospect of regime change in Russia, always provided, and this is one point where I presume Putin does understand this, always provided that he doesn't sort out the situation militarily and then negotiate some kind, or whatever happens, that he doesn't negotiate some kind of peace agreement which the Russian people would see as a humiliation. And I think if he does that, if he's seen to betray Donbass or betray the people, the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and I mean, I really speak about Putin, agreeing to some kind of deal which, Russian public opinion would not accept, then he might be in political trouble. But I think he understands that too. But for the moment, I don't think there's any chance of regime change in Moscow. I think this is a Western wet dream, one they can't give up on, but I don't think they have any chance of achieving it.
All right. The Duran.locals.com Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code Good Day. And look for us on Rockfin as well. The Duran is on Rockfin as well. Take care.